The year was 1347. The Black Death had yet to arrive. And Europe, though draped in cloaks of incense and ritual, was already festering beneath its jeweled surface. Let me take you to a place rarely charted, buried beneath a forest in what is now southern France, once known as Saint. There, carved into the belly of a limestone cliff, was a forgotten monastery, a haven not of prayer, but of pleasure, sanctified not by saints, but by something far more ancient and far more profane. It was called the Velvet Chapel. There are no official records of its existence, only fragments, whispered by traveling monks, hinted at in the margins of excommunicated texts, scratched in Latin and Old Occitane ubi caro orat, where flesh prays. Its founder was a man named Prior T, once a Benedictine scholar of great promise, who, after a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, returned with eyes too dark to meet and a hunger that made even silence tremble. Thibaut believed that true divinity could be found not in denial of the flesh, but in its exaltation. He preached a gospel where the union of bodies reflected the union of heaven and earth. It began innocently, perhaps, a reinterpretation of the Song of Songs, a sensual liturgy sung by candlelight. But the songs grew stranger, the candles grew redder, and the doors to the chapel were sealed. Inside, rituals unfolded that defied both Rome and reason. The monks, all men once sworn to chastity, had abandoned their robes for silken satin. They spoke in tongues, drank wine from ivory pelvises, and painted each other's bodies with sacred oils, fragrant blends of myrrh and human musk. They called it transverbration of the flesh, a kind of holy wounding, where pleasure was a wound through which the divine could enter. Once a year during the feast of St. Agatha, they reenacted what Thibaut claimed was the lost rite of Eros crucified. A chosen novice would be strapped in naked to a wooden cross. Around him, the monks would chant and anoint his limbs, not with blood but with the warm milk of their own yearning. The novice, bathed in agony and ecstasy, would then speak in angelic language, a glossolalia Thibaut insisted was the true voice of God. Whether from trance or trauma, no one could say. There was one rule within the Velvet Chapel: do not desire possession. Desire was to remain communal, without jealousy or claim. But men are not angels. And in time, this rule was broken. A young man named Alaric joined the order. Golden-haired, with a voice like a cathedral organ, he became Thibaut's obsession. The prior declared him the Corpus Dei, the living embodiment of divine pleasure. Alaric, for a time, surrendered to the rituals. He was paraded in crimson veils, his skin brushed with goose feathers dipped in rose oil, his mouth fed daily with honey and figs. They say his eyes never blinked, as if even sight itself had become a prayer. But Alaric fell in love with another monk, Brother Pascal, and love, as it always does, spoiled the purity of the rite. Thibaut grew sick with jealousy. His sermons turned bitter, laced with warnings of the rod of singular affection. Then, during the next Eros crucified rite, Thibaut did the unthinkable. He selected both Alaric and Pascal as offerings, bound them together with iron thorns, declared them twin martyrs of corrupted desire. What followed was so horrific that even the most depraved records merely state. And thus, the velvet was stained. Pascal died that night. Alaric disappeared. A week later, the chapel was found empty. No monks, just a scent thick, sweet, and cloying like incense, soaked in meat. And on the altar, carved into the wood, one word. Some say Thibaut and his followers descended into the tunnels beneath the chapel, seeking an abyss where no sunlight could judge them. Others believe the earth swallowed them whole, punishing their arrogance with a second fall. But here is the strangest part. In 1943, during the German occupation of France, a detachment of SS soldiers camped near the same cliff. They never returned to their unit. Only one journal was recovered from the wreckage, written by a soldier named Croll. He described a warm chamber beneath the stone, draped in crimson, where voices whispered promises through the rock. He ended with a single sentence: I touched the velvet, and it touched back. What was the Velvet Chapel? A monastery of liberated desire, a cult of blasphemous ecstasy, or something older than either, an ancient hunger, dressed in ritual? We cannot say, but the echoes remain in dreams, in myths, in the soft rustle of silk, in the night. And if ever you walk through Saint Demorts and feel a sudden warmth, a fragrance of myrrh and sweat, stop, listen. You may be closer than you think. There is a peculiar pattern in history. When depravity is buried, it tends to bloom beneath the soil. Decades passed after the disappearance of the Velvet Chapel. Centuries, even, but the legend was not dead. It had merely taken root, and in the 1480s, it sprouted again in a most unexpected place. The cloistered gardens of a convent in the Low Countries, on the outskirts of Britain. It was called the Garden of St. Euphemia, home to a reclusive order of nuns, known as Sores Penitentes de Luxuriata. They were said to be caretakers of fallen women, offering repentance and redemption. But unofficially, they were something else entirely, a lineage of spiritual daughters said to descend not from Christ, but from Alaric, the vanished angel of the Velvet Chapel. The founder of the order, Mother Imelda of Ghent claimed to have received nightly visions of a radiant man wrapped in crimson veils, whose voice spoke in both Latin and longing. He called her Filia Lucis. Carnali's daughter of Carnalitan gave her instructions for building a sacred garden where sins could be turned into sacraments. This garden, enclosed by high stone walls, was said to be unlike any other. Flowers grew there that bled when plucked. Fountains bubbled not with water, but with thick, perfumed oils. Statues of angels with hollow mouths were arranged in circles, and beneath each one, a small alcove padded with cushions and silk. The sisters tended the garden by day, but by night they hosted what came to be known as the Lamentations. Women from every corner of Europe were drawn to the convent in shame, but in secret desperation. Widows, noblewomen, the wives of priests, they came under the cover of darkness to confess their forbidden desires. But these confessions were not spoken to God. They were performed. Each sister was trained in the ars lidrae divineth, divine art of lust, a blend of theater, touch, and something far stranger. One might embody the virgin's yearning. Another would perform the dance of Magdalene's despair. A third would lie motionless, weeping silently until her tears soaked the ground, said to fertilize the sacred roots. These acts, the sisters taught, purged desire through its most complete expression. It was sin as symphony, redemption as climax. But not all who entered the garden left whole. In 1492, a young woman named Isabeau de Clermont entered the convent. She was the daughter of a duke, promised to a bishop, and known for her fierce piety. But within weeks of entering the garden, she changed. Her eyes turned glassy. She would mutter songs under her breath in no known tongue. At night, she would stand naked beneath the moonlight, arms open, whispering, "I am the bride of velvet." Mother Imelda took this as a sign. She declared Isabeau, the vestalis ultimuta, final, vessel, the sacred fruit of generations of flesh-born faith. A ritual was planned, said to be the culmination of the order's hidden purpose, a marriage, not of man and woman, but of flesh and myth. The rite took place under a lunar eclipse. Every statue in the garden was draped in black. The sisters, dressed in translucent gowns, formed a procession around Isabeau, who lay atop a bed of bleeding lilies. She was silent, still, eyes open but unblinking, as though caught in some ecstatic trance. The ceremony lasted 3 days. Drums echoed from within the earth, and when it ended, Isabeau was gone. Some say she ascended, body and soul, into the velvet void beyond this world. Others say she was buried beneath the garden, her flesh meant to feed the roots that would birth a new god. But whatever happened, the convent was never the same. Within a year, the garden withered. The statues cracked. The sisters began to lose their voices. One by one, they wandered out of the cloister and into the forests. Some naked, others bleeding, all of them whispering fragments of unknown scripture. He waits beneath the roots. He waits in silk. He waits with teeth. When the Bishop of Bruges finally ordered the convent shuttered in 1494, only 3 sisters remained. All were blind. One had sewn her lips shut. Another had carved the word Amar into her chest with a rosary nail. The last simply rocked back and forth in her cell, murmuring, "He came to me wrapped in velvet and spoke in flowers." I said yes. The church tried to cleanse the place. The garden was burned, the walls torn down, and the soil salted. But no crops have ever grown there since. And every spring, without fail, lilies bloom blood red, with petals soft as silk and centers that smell faintly of skin. Some say the garden of St. Euphemia was a hoax. Others call it hysteria, or the madness of women trapped too long in silence. But I wonder, if you've stood in that barren field today and placed your ear to the earth, what might you hear? The beating of drums, the rustle of veils, or the whisper of someone still waiting to be confessed? By the early 1600s, the stories of the Velvet Chapel and the Garden of St. Euphemia had faded into superstition-fragmented whispers buried in apocrypha and folklore. But sometimes, history doesn't die. It molts in the candlelit chambers of Prague, under the shadow of Emperor Rudolf II's decadent court. The ancient hunger found new form, more surgical, more scientific, yet no less grotesque. Enter Dr. Matthias Croll, a man of unmatched brilliance and unspeakable appetites. Croll had studied in Padua, dissected the condemned in Venice, and claimed to have learned the art of preserving the human body from a forgotten manuscript bound in infant skin. He was not merely an anatomist, he was, in his own words, a cartographer of pleasure's architecture. And under the guise of imperial funding, he turned the basement of Prague's alchemical college into what he called the Red Theater. There, beneath vaulted stone, he built his magnum opus, Corpus Speculatis, the mirrored body. It was not a text, but a living archive. Dozens of preserved cadavers, each posed captured in positions of ecstasy, agony, or some sublime intersection of both. The bodies were not merely dissected, but augmented, tongues gilded in gold leaf, nerves replaced with silver wire, nipples engraved with esoteric sigils, Croll believed each point of pleasure in the body corresponded to a divine frequency, and as Gall less than mapping the soul through arousal. But Croll's work was more than academic. He sought volunteers, and they came. Not the destitute or insane, but nobles, bishops, artists, even a visiting Ottoman emissary, who claimed his ancestors had spoken of a velvet god buried in the earth. These supplicants came not for fame, but for release from pain, from morality, from the burden of being only flesh. And Croll obliged them, recording each session as experientia luxuriosa luxurious experiments. One of his earliest testaments, still preserved in code, tells of Lady Verana von Stahls, a widow of 25 who had never once known touch. She was bound not by rope, but by pearl cords, blindfolded with her late husband's burial sack, and made to recite from a text Croll claimed had once belonged to Prior Thibaut himself. For hours, he traced her spine with a heated scalpel not to harm, but to awaken her dorsal, him. When she climaxed, she let out a sound so high and inhuman, it cracked the mirror in the chamber. She died the next morning, smiling, and with a golden tongue clutched between her teeth. By 1604, Croll had become both legend and pariah. The church demanded his execution, but Rudolph II, fascinated and increasingly unstable, shielded him. And so Croll continued. He claimed to have discovered the nodus carnalisa, carnal node where the soul exited the body during climax. It was located, he wrote, behind the breastbone, nested between desire and despair. In one experiment, he removed this node from a lover mid-orgasm, preserving it in mercury. He wrote, it still pulses when spoken to in Latin, but all obsessions turn inward. Croll became gaunt, hallucinating shadows that stroked him as he worked. He began whispering to the cadavers. Claimed, they answered. Claimed one called itself is. His final entry, dated December 21, 1606, simply read, the velvet has veins. That winter, a fire consumed the Red Theater. Officially, it was deemed an accident, but those who witnessed it described screaming not of people, but of something vast and wet, like a cathedral filled with lungs. In the ashes, they found no bones, only veins, long glistening cords of muscle and silk, threaded through the stone. For years, nothing more was said of Dr. Croll. But rumors grew. Prostitutes near the river claimed to see a man with mirror eyes and stitched lips offering divine incision. A midwife in Vienna described delivering a child that came out whispering, I've been here before. And in 1666, a physician in Nuremberg opened a sealed package containing an anatomically correct heart made of velvet pulsing faintly. It was signed, for the next cartographer. So what became of Croll? Did he die in the fire or transcend it, becoming fleshless, stitched into the secret history of desire? We cannot know, but his diagrams survive, buried in restricted vaults, smuggled in grip, reproduced in the dreams of surgeons too long alone. Some say every orgasm is a portal, and every moan is a key. And somewhere, in the endless red chambers between our ribs, he waits with his scalpel and his smile. By the 19th century, the myths had become smudged, washed out by Enlightenment, rationalism, and buried beneath layers of disbelief. The Velvet Chapel was a legend. The Garden of St. Euphemia, dismissed as hysteria, Dr. Croll. A grotesque footnote in medical obscurity. But what man forgets, the body remembers. And in 1834, in the shadowed corridors of an asylum just outside Vienna, the velvet stirred again. They called it Haus der Wiederkehr Fut, House of Return. Officially, it was a private sanatorium for women afflicted with unnatural melancholia, funded discreetly by the Habsburg court. It was run by a reclusive doctor named Clemens Alder, once a celebrated psychiatrist turned silent recluse. He spoke little, wrote even less. But within those walls, he conducted what he described as therapeutic reintroduction to sacred sensation. Every patient brought to Haus der Wiederkunft had one thing in common. Dreamed, not just nightmares, but recurring visions of red curtains, bleeding flowers, golden tongues, and hands that emerged from the walls, beckoning with fingers made of silk. They came from across Europe. Aristocratic daughters, opera singers, a nun. One woman, Greta Sess, claimed that something inside her hummed when the moon was full. Another described her womb as a cathedral with locked doors. Dr. Alder's methods were unconventional. Patients were dressed in robes, woven with crimson thread. They were forbidden mirrors but encouraged to stare into silver basins filled with water, infused with opium and rose oil. For hours, they sat in padded rooms listening to low-frequency chants composed from anatomical diagrams. One patient reported hearing the voice of a fetus reciting scripture in reverse. But the centerpiece of Alder's treatment was the Velvet Chamber, a soundproof underground sanctuary, with no light, only texture. Inside, the walls were covered in undulating velvet, stitched in spirals, ridges, folds meant to mimic the inner canal of the human body. Each woman was instructed to crawl through it, to listen, to surrender. Some emerged shaking, speechless. Others came back smiling, eyes rolling upward, murmuring, He remembers me. Alder kept meticulous records, but never published them. His notes refer to a phenomenon he called the echo of Isabeau, a transgenerational memory, passed not through blood, but through pleasure. He theorized that ecstasy, true unbridled surrendero, and neurogator, what he called the velvet archive, a reservoir of ancient experiences stored not in the mind, but in the meat of our lineage. Then came patient 53. She was brought in during the winter of 1834. No name, no documents. She spoke a dialect no one could identify. Her skin was covered in faint sigils, geometric tattoos that seemed to shimmer in candlelight. She refused food, refused speech, but when placed in the velvet chamber, she sang, not a lullaby, but a litany, an operatic surge of vow and breath that made the walls tremble. Other patients wept uncontrollably. One entered Tisha. Another went blind for 2 days. Alder, overwhelmed, collapsed at her feet. When he awoke, he wrote one sentence in his journal. She is the root. Over the following nights, strange phenomena overtook the asylum. Furniture warped. Velvet grew over doorframes. Patients began to merge dreams, waking at the same time, whispering the same name. On the 7th night, all 27 patients vanished. No trace, no struggle. Just robes on the floor and eccentric, floral, and unmistakably human. Alder was found in the velvet chamber, naked, weeping, his body sewn from mouth to pelvis with red thread. On the wall, scrawled in a mixture of blood and perfume, was a sigil resembling a flower with 13 petals at center, a staring, vertical eye. The asylum was closed, sealed, burned. The Habsburgs denied its existence. The church labeled the incident mass hysteria compounded by immoral treatment. But the rumors never stopped. In 1899, a British explorer named Harold Penrose vanished during an expedition in the Carpathian. His last letter, sent from a village called Saint-Imor, claimed he had discovered a monastery beneath the soil saw warm and breathing. In 1923, a French medium held a in Bruges and began speaking in tongues no one could place. She scrawled the words, "The garden has roots in the womb," on the walls before her heart stopped mid. And in 1997, a package was delivered anonymously to the pathology department of the University of Prague. Inside was a velvet heart, perfectly preserved, still warm. So what is the truth? Is there a thread that binds the heresies of Taboo, the ecstasies of Euphemia, the dissections of Croll, and the awakenings of Alder? Are they iterations of a single pulse? One that beats not in time, but in yearning? A hunger buried not beneath cities but beneath skin. If you ever feel a trembling in your ribs when you are touched, if a certain scent makes your breath hitch for reasons you cannot name, if your dreams echo with red halls and silk hands, you may already be part of it. Because the velvet doesn't die. It waits, it listens, and it remembers.